The fire is almost out. What's left of it barely glows beneath a thin crust of ash, like the last ember of civilization trying to survive another medieval night. The air inside the hut is thick, heavy with smoke that bites the throat and makes the eyes water. Every breath tastes of wood and damp earth. The walls creak as wind presses against them, and frost creeps inward through the cracks. Outside, the night is a white silence. Inside, the only sound is the slow exhale of people sleeping close together beneath rough wool and animal skins, their bodies forming a single trembling heap of warmth. It's easy to forget how dark the world once was. No hum of machinery, no hiss of a radiator, just the long patience of cold. When winter came, it wasn't a season, it was a siege. Every hour without flame felt like time itself was freezing. You could hear the cold, in the crack of ice forming on the bucket, in the stiff rattle of breath from your own lungs. And yet somehow they lived. You could say the medieval home wasn't built for comfort. It was built to endure. Long before chimneys, radiators, or even glass windows, warmth was a luxury that had to be engineered from scratch. Every decision, where to build, what to burn, how to sleep, even how to breathe, determined whether a family would wake up or simply never wake again. The hearth was the heart of the world. The Latin word for focus, the one we still use today, literally meant fireplace. It wasn't a coincidence. The fire decided everything. Who sat closest, who was fed first, who had power. Lords and peasants alike revolved around that same fragile light. Picture it. A single open flame in the centre of a room. No chimney above it. The smoke crawling upward until it hit the rafters, then rolling sideways through a hole in the roof. Sometimes it escaped. Often it didn't. That's why medieval ceilings turned black within a year of construction. Wood polished with soot and despair. But smoke wasn't just a curse. It was the first heating system they ever invented. And it was ingenious. The thick haze trapped beneath the roof created an artificial insulation layer, like a woolen blanket of carbon and air. It stopped the worst of the heat from escaping. The smoke that made eyes sting was also what kept the frost from forming on the beams. People learned to live inside it, eyes half closed, lungs half burned, but alive. When archaeologists opened Viking and early medieval homes, they found soot layers half a centimetre thick on ceilings. Not from neglect, but from design. It was the price of survival. If you walked into one of those houses in the dead of January, your first instinct would be to flee. The smell of smoke, sweat, and fermenting food. The low ceiling pressing down. The walls are sweating with tar and condensation. But then as your eyes adjusted, you'd see something else. People gathered like planets around their sun, sharing stories, carving, weaving, mending nets, each face lit by that one trembling light. That's how the medieval world looked at night. Small, glowing islands of warmth in an endless dark ocean. The heat was communal, not personal. There was no my space or your room. Everyone's breath was part of the system. Families, servants, and livestock often shared the same air, sometimes even the same roof. In many peasant homes, animals were kept inside overnight, separated by nothing but a low partition. Their body heat alone could raise the temperature by several degrees. The smell was unbearable, but it meant survival. And in that mix of ingenuity and desperation, people began to invent, not comfort, but control. They started experimenting with stone, clay, and metal to manipulate fire instead of just enduring it. Slowly, homes turned into machines of survival. What began as an open flame in the dirt evolved into the first primitive hearths. Raised platforms lined with flat stones that absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night. Those stones became ancient batteries of warmth. Archaeologists in Scandinavia and Northern Europe have found that early hearths were often built near walls, deliberately designed to radiate heat sideways rather than straight upward. Builders didn't know the word thermodynamics, but they understood it by instinct. Imagine waking up before dawn, the fire out, the air icy, your eyelashes stiff with frost. You crawl from under a wool blanket and press your palm against the stone wall. It's still faintly warm. The fire you built 12 hours ago is still working silently inside the house's bones. The medieval home was not primitive. It was experimental, a laboratory of survival conducted with mud, timber, and fear. And every structure had to answer the same question. How do you keep the heat from dying before you do? That question defined entire civilizations. It shaped where people built their towns, how they organised their families, even how they prayed. Monks in cold monasteries developed rituals for tending the night fire, spiritual duty disguised as thermal maintenance. In the north, Norse settlers built homes half buried in earth so the soil itself could act as insulation. Each region became its own answer to the same problem, but none of them, not even the wealthiest kings, ever truly conquered the cold. They only learned how to negotiate with it. Because in the Middle Ages, warmth wasn't comfort, it was a miracle. The sound of fire was language. Every crack and hiss inside a medieval home meant something. A story, a warning, a promise. The way the logs split, the rhythm of the burning, even the colour of the smoke told you if the wood was green, wet, or ready. A clean, bright flame meant safety. A choking, sputtering one meant death in your sleep. Because the truth was simple. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't die from freezing. They died from smoke. Imagine sleeping inches from a fire that's both your lifeline and your assassin. A slow smoulder overnight could fill the entire room with poison, invisible in the dark. So they learned to listen. The fire's voice became a heartbeat, a guardian, a companion they feared to ignore. But every invention that saved them came with a hidden cost. Early builders across Europe and Scandinavia realised that warmth was useless if you couldn't breathe. Too much smoke and the fire went out. Too much draught and the people froze. The art of home heating became the art of balance. A constant, fragile negotiation between oxygen and safety. In Saxon England, homes were one-room structures with a central hearth and a smoke hole above. The whole worked like a crude chimney, but only when the wind allowed it. A sudden gust could blow the smoke right back inside, turning every breath into pain. Still, it was an improvement. They'd learned to shape the roof into a low cone, forcing hot air to roll along it and radiate downward before escaping. That knowledge spread silently from culture to culture, not by books but by hands. A father teaching his son how to read the air. A woman showed her daughter how to bank embers before sleep, so the fire would wake before they did. Generations of engineering passed down through instinct. Then in the colder north, the Vikings took the idea of the hearth and made it something greater. Their longhouses were masterpieces of thermal survival. Long, narrow and low-roofed, they were built to trap air and waste nothing. A single central fire stretched down the spine of the house, stone-lined and surrounded by benches layered with furs. The heat radiated out evenly, absorbed by the wooden walls and the bodies sleeping against them. But the real genius was the smoke. Viking longhouses had no chimneys, not for lack of knowledge, but by choice. Instead, smoke drifted through the entire interior, saturating every timber with tar and ash. It was a slow, painful way to live, but it waterproofed the walls and sterilised the air. Smoke killed insects, mould, and disease. Every cough from a Viking home came with protection built into it. Archaeologists say those homes looked primitive, but in practice, they were perfectly tuned survival machines. At dawn, when the door opened to the frozen fjord, the heat didn't rush out. It bled out slowly, as if the air itself had weight. The smoke-trapped ceiling acted as insulation. The low entrance kept drafts from entering. Even the benches were designed with purpose, raised just enough for air circulation, low enough to stay in the warmest pocket of the room. Inside, life revolved around the hearth. It was the law, the altar, and the parliament of the house. No one crossed it without reason. When sagas speak of sitting in the high seat, they don't just mean rank, they mean distance from the fire. The closer you sat, the more important you were. And the hearth fire itself was sacred. It was never allowed to die. Families carried embers wrapped in moss or dung when they moved, ensuring the same flame, the same lineage, lived on in their next home. Some even swore oaths before the hearth, believing it to be a living witness. From Viking-age Scandinavia to Anglo-Saxon Britain, fire wasn't decoration, it was continuity, the pulse that kept a lineage alive through the cold centuries. But while the North learned to survive smoke, the South was learning to rise above it. In continental Europe, stone castles and manors began to appear, vast, beautiful, and deadly in winter. Lords who once slept near open fires now found themselves freezing in rooms big enough for wind to roam. The same stone that symbolised strength became a curse. Heat bled through walls like blood through linen. The stronger their homes became, the colder they grew. And so began the next great experiment: how to bend stone itself into warmth. Builders began lining walls with tapestries, hanging thick drapes over doorways to trap air. They laid rushes and straw on floors to block drafts that crawled up from below. In some castles, people slept in beds enclosed by wooden canopies, private tents within stone fortresses, breathing in their own warmth while the rest of the hall froze solid. The wealthy fought cold with layers of space, a fire in the great hall for display, and smaller hidden fires in private chambers for survival. Servants and guards stood between those two worlds, caught in the liminal cold of corridors where no fire ever reached. The poor fought it differently. They shared heat. Families huddled together under single wool blankets, sometimes with children sleeping in drawers or wooden boxes stuffed with straw. Every object in a home became part of the thermal system. Barrels filled with water to absorb daytime warmth, stones placed by the fire to be rolled under beds at night, even bread ovens reused as sleeping alcoves. These weren't crude people. They were engineers trapped in a world that kept trying to kill them. And in that darkness, surrounded by stone and smoke, they discovered a strange kind of intimacy, a warmth that wasn't just physical. Because when heat was rare, it became sacred. To share it meant trust. To keep it meant power. The first chimney was a miracle that nobody trusted. When it appeared in Europe around the 12th century, it looked absurd. A tower for smoke. People didn't understand it. They thought it would make their homes colder, not warmer. After all, for thousands of years, the smoke itself had been the insulation. To let it escape felt like letting life escape. But for those willing to experiment, the chimney changed everything. It was the first time in history that humans separated heat from fire. Before that, warmth meant sitting in the same air that burned your lungs. The invention of the chimney turned heat into something that could be directed, manipulated, and refined. For the first time, you could have a fire without suffocating in it. At first, chimneys were crude. A small flue carved through a wooden roof, lined with clay or stone, to keep it from catching fire. Smoke didn't rise neatly through it. It struggled, rolled, and coughed its way upward like a creature trying to escape. Builders discovered that if the shaft was too wide, the heat vanished too quickly. If too narrow, the smoke choked the room again. It took generations to perfect the dimensions, and those who did became the quiet masters of medieval comfort. The transition was slow. For centuries, only castles, monasteries, and wealthy manors could afford a chimney. In those buildings, you could walk from one century to another just by stepping through a doorway. One room still dark and smoky like the ancient world, another strangely clean, the air clear, the warmth steady and controlled. To the medieval mind, it must have felt like magic. Heat could be summoned and shaped. You could decide where it went and where it didn't. Fire was no longer a guest in the home. It had become a servant. But every time humanity conquered the cold, it paid with something else. The chimney took away the smoke, and with it, the natural insulation that kept older homes warm. It dried the air, made walls brittle, and changed the way houses smelled. The scent of wood smoke that once clung to every beam, every cloak, every hand, the smell of life itself, began to vanish. Something else changed too. People stopped living together around one central fire. The hearth, once the gravitational centre of the family, began to fade into the background. Each person could have their own small source of heat. A private fire, a private space. Warmth became solitary. Comfort became personal. The shift that would one day create modern privacy began with a single chimney. In monasteries, the effects were even more profound. Monks who once shared the cold as part of spiritual discipline began to debate whether warmth was a sin. Some believed fire softened the will, made the flesh complacent. Others saw it as divine mercy, a gift meant to be used with gratitude. In their stone refectories, you can still see the great fireplaces that marked this uneasy truce between survival and sanctity. Enormous hearths framed by arches blackened with centuries of soot. The technology spread outward. By the 14th century, towns began to bloom with red-tiled roofs punctured by narrow chimney stacks. Smoke no longer poured from windows. It ascended in elegant columns, symbols of progress and prosperity. But even as the upper floors grew warmer, the streets below remained frozen. The poor couldn't afford the luxury of direction. They relied on clever tricks that turned necessity into invention. Some hung heavy curtains from their ceilings to trap heat in the lower half of the room. Others packed walls with moss, straw, or dung for insulation. In some regions, families built tiny sleeping boxes, wooden frames covered in fabric, where they crawled in like hibernating animals to preserve their own body heat. It was a strange paradox. The richer society became, the colder its poor lived. The Middle Ages were never an age of ignorance. They were an age of adaptation. When wood grew scarce, people dug deeper, pulling peat, dried turf, and even animal dung from the earth to burn. Each material burned differently, with its own rhythm and smell. Peat fires gave off a deep, steady heat that seemed to hum in the air. Dung burned fast, sharp and loud. In some monasteries, where silence was law, the sudden crackle of dung fuel was considered almost scandalous. Meanwhile, in the frozen north, the Norse and their descendants developed a method far ahead of its time. They learned to bury their hearths partially into the ground, creating a natural heat sink. The soil itself became part of the system, absorbing warmth by day, releasing it through the night. It was the primitive ancestor of the radiant floor. And in parts of medieval Korea and later Eastern Europe, this principle reached perfection, the ondol and hippocaust. Underfloor heating systems that used flues beneath the floor to carry hot air and smoke, warming the stones above. Some Roman influence remained in these designs, whispering through centuries of experimentation. The concept had never truly died. It had merely gone underground, waiting for the world to grow cold enough to remember it. The idea of storing heat, not just making it, would eventually transform architecture itself. The great masonry hearths of the later Middle Ages weren't just fireplaces, they were heat engines. Builders began adding side benches and niches near the fire, warm alcoves where people could sleep or sit to heal from illness. In some regions, thick-walled tile stoves appeared, cachalofans in the Germanic world, sealed systems that captured heat from a small fire and released it for hours. A single well-made stove could warm an entire room long after the last ember died. It was the closest thing they had to eternal fire. To sit beside one was to feel time slow. The air didn't sting or bite. It glowed. The warmth wasn't just temperature, it was presence. By the 15th century, these tile stoves had become a status symbol. The wealthiest homes covered them in painted ceramics, green, blue, ochre, decorated with saints or geometric patterns that caught the flicker of light. The fire that had once hidden in the dirt now stood proudly, like a piece of art. But even that progress carried its ghost. For while homes grew warmer, the world outside was beginning to freeze harder than ever. The Little Ice Age crept across Europe, shrinking harvests and lengthening winters. It tested every innovation mankind had made. Some people survived it through ingenuity, others through sheer stubbornness. And still, even in their finest stone halls, many froze. Because heat wasn't just a question of fire anymore. It was a question of hierarchy. Who controlled the warmth controlled the world. The fire in a peasant home was rarely bright. It was a whisper of flame. A faint orange glow crawling through the embers, stretching its last breath into the long night. You could see it from the road sometimes, just a weak pulse of light leaking through a hole in the thatch, or from between two planks of wood. But that glow meant life. Inside, someone was fighting the same ancient enemy that had haunted humankind since the first winter. In the great castles, fire was a symbol. In the peasant's hut, it was a negotiation. The poor couldn't afford to waste wood. Every log had to justify itself. They learned to keep a flame alive not through abundance, but through patience. At dusk, when the family gathered around the hearth, someone always had the same duty: to prepare the night fire. It wasn't a blaze, it was an ember carefully buried beneath ash, a controlled suffocation. Done right, it would smoulder till dawn. Done wrong, and everyone would wake to frost on their blankets and ice on their breath. The entire rhythm of medieval domestic life revolved around that ritual. There was no turning off the lights. There was banking the fire, and people built their days backward from that moment. When darkness came, families closed the shutters, stuffed rags or straw into the gaps, and layered the floor with whatever they could find: rushes, hay, or even animal hair. The walls were already insulated with mud or moss. The air became heavy, trapped, and thick with human presence. But that was the goal: to create a living ecosystem of warmth where every breath mattered. The medieval home was not a house, it was a body. Each person acted like an organ, contributing heat to the whole. The elderly were seated nearest the hearth, not out of honour alone, but necessity. Their thin skin and brittle bones absorbed warmth better. They became thermal anchors. Infants were kept in cradles near the coals, while the strong slept farther away, along the outer walls, forming a human barrier against the drafts. Even the animals were part of this system. In many northern homes, from Scandinavia to the Alps, livestock slept indoors at night, separated only by a low wall. A single cow could raise the interior temperature of a room by several degrees. Sheep gave warmth twice, once with their wool and again with their breath. It wasn't pleasant. The smell of manure mixed with smoke could cling to your hair for days, but it kept frostbite from claiming your fingers while you slept. In some places, families went further. They dug the floor of their homes deeper into the earth, creating semi-subterranean shelters that borrowed heat from the soil itself. Archaeologists have found layers of ash, bones and straw fused together in these pits. Evidence of lives lived in tight, smoky darkness. Yet those homes, however primitive, were proof of genius. Without science, without tools, these people were using geothermal insulation centuries before the term existed. They didn't have thermometers, but they understood warmth better than we do. If you stepped into one of their houses, you'd see small tricks everywhere. A pot of water placed near the fire to retain humidity. Walls darkened intentionally to absorb sunlight. Stones preheated during the day and slipped under sleeping mats at night. Every object had a second purpose, and every mistake had consequences. When wood was scarce, families turned to fuel that modern people would never dare to burn: dried dung, peat, reeds, or even bundles of seaweed. Each region had its scent. You could tell where someone came from by how their smoke smelled. Highlanders smelled of heather and turf, lowland farmers of straw and ash, coastal people of salt and rot. The warmth of a home was its identity, and in an age without insulation or windows, identity was survival. When dawn came, the night fire would be stirred back to life, the room filling once more with smoke and the sounds of waking. Coughing, boots scraping the floor, the slow stretching of limbs after another successful siege against the cold. In richer towns, carpenters began experimenting with new designs. Small, portable braziers made of iron or clay that could be carried from room to room. They were dangerous and inefficient, but they introduced something entirely new to European life: personal heat. You could warm yourself instead of your house. The idea was intoxicating. Warmth was becoming individual, and that changed everything. In time, those braziers would evolve into more advanced technologies: closed stoves, heated stones, and even the first metal grates that turned the hearth into a controlled engine. But for most of medieval Europe, those luxuries were faraway dreams. The peasants stayed with what they had: fire, breath, and the living architecture of their own bodies. To them, cold wasn't an inconvenience. It was a fact of life, woven into the rhythm of prayer and labour. Every morning they thanked God for warmth the way we thank him for air. And when someone died, one of the last acts of mourning was to let the household fire go out. The flame extinguished as the body left the earth. The connection between life and heat was never metaphorical. It was literal. Some chroniclers describe winter villages, from a distance, faint halos of smoke rising from roofs, each one marking a family still alive. Those who failed to keep the fire overnight left roofs without smoke by dawn, and neighbours would know before anyone spoke. Warmth was a language, and silence meant death. In that silence, the idea of heat began to grow into something more than survival. It became a symbol of order, of faith, of mastery over chaos. To build a fire was to rebuild the world. And so, while the poor kept the old ways, embers buried under ash, shared breath, and animal warmth, the builders and thinkers of the later Middle Ages began chasing a different dream. A fire so controlled, so efficient, that it could outlive the night itself. The dream of endless heat would change the shape of every home in Europe. And eventually, the way people thought about comfort itself. By the end of the Middle Ages, warmth had become a kind of ambition. It was no longer just a matter of survival. It was proof of civilization itself. But even as the world grew richer, the cold never really went away. The castles, abbeys, and manors that symbolised human progress were still colder than the poorest peasant's hut. You could light 10 fires in a great hall and still see your breath. Medieval architecture was built to impress, not to protect. A stone castle looked eternal, but to those who lived inside, it was a refrigerator of power. Thick granite walls trapped damp air. Wind howled through arrow slits. Frost bloomed on the inside of windows. The same stones that could resist a siege were powerless against winter. And yet people learned to fight back, not with luxury, but with engineering. The architecture itself became a silent war against the cold. Builders learned that warmth wasn't just about fire, it was about airflow. The draft that stole heat from one chamber could be redirected to another. Corridors and staircases became wind tunnels, angled and curved to keep warmth where it was needed most. Every hall, every wall, every stone had to be part of the plan. They built double walls in some chambers, filling the gap with sand or straw to create early insulation. In northern France, masons experimented with layered plaster that trapped air bubbles. Invisible but effective. Floors were raised slightly off the ground to avoid contact with the frozen earth, and ceilings dropped lower over sleeping quarters, compressing heat like a lid over a pot. In the great castles of England and Germany, warmth was a privilege that came from rank and geography. Lords and ladies occupied the upper chambers, where heat from the great hall below would rise and gather. Servants slept in the corners nearest the fire or in the kitchen, not for comfort, but because it was the only warm place left. The visual grandeur of a medieval castle hid 1,000 small survival strategies. Tapestries weren't just decoration, they were armour for the walls. A woven scene of knights and saints could block wind better than any stone. Beneath the tapestry you'd find straw, moss or wool pressed into the cracks. The real insulation beneath the art. Curtains hung around beds weren't aesthetic either. They trapped breath, recycled heat, and turned sleep into a small act of engineering. When a noble slept in a canopy bed with thick curtains drawn, they were effectively sleeping in their own private tent, a warm, humid bubble in a frozen palace. The medieval bed was the first climate-controlled space. Beneath the mattress of straw and wool, servants sometimes placed heated stones wrapped in cloth. In the morning, those same stones would be carried to the lord's chair or desk, the medieval version of portable heating. Bed warmers, small metal pans filled with embers, glowed red under sheets as people prayed they wouldn't ignite the linens before morning. Every class had its own answer to the same question. How do you trap warmth when the world itself refuses to give it? For peasants, the answer was proximity. For nobles, it was architecture. The kitchens of great castles became the true engines of warmth. Fireplaces the size of wagons burned day and night, heating not just food, but the air that bled upward through cracks and corridors. The kitchens were hellish, smoky, blistering, and full of danger, but they were the heart of the building's climate. Even servants sleeping on stone floors nearby were better off than those in unheated towers. Every ember was a negotiation between comfort and control. If a castle's fire burned too low, food spoiled and tempers flared. Too high, and the smoke filled the great hall, choking the guests. Fire wasn't just maintenance, it was politics. The steward who managed the wood supply controlled comfort itself. In some accounts, lords kept separate inventories for wood, measuring it like treasure. In monasteries, it was a different story. Monks saw heat as a test of faith. Many orders allowed fire only in communal rooms. The dormitories remained unheated by design, forcing discipline through discomfort. Only the infirmary, where the sick lay in silence, was given the gift of steady warmth. Some monasteries even engineered their fireplaces to serve both the living and the dead. One flue directed heat to the refectory, another to the crypt below. The human relationship with warmth was never moral neutral. To be warm could mean to be sinful, indulgent or privileged. To be cold was to be pure, patient, faithful. The frost became part of religion itself. But outside the cloisters and walls, the people continued to innovate quietly. In villages, builders began experimenting with lime plaster mixed with animal hair, a flexible material that trapped heat and resisted cracking. Roofs were lined with clay tiles or layered thatch, sometimes more than 1/2 metre thick, to catch warmth before it vanished into the sky. Windows were covered with thin oiled parchment, or stretched animal bladder, translucent, not transparent, but enough to keep the wind out while letting in a dim ghost of light. You could walk from a manor to a hut and see two completely different philosophies of heat. One grand, one practical. The noble's home looked powerful, but leaked warmth like water from a cracked pot. The peasant's home looked fragile, yet held warmth in its bones. The poorer the builder, the smarter the design. The ingenuity was everywhere. In Scandinavia, people dug pit houses, half-buried dwellings insulated by earth. In the Alps, they stacked homes directly above stables, so the animals' breath warmed the rooms above. In Iceland, they built turf houses with walls so thick that even when the wind screamed outside, the interior stayed as quiet as prayer. These were not desperate people clinging to survival. They were engineers of necessity. The climate forced them to invent, and in doing so, they created techniques modern architecture still envies. Because they understood something we've forgotten. Warmth doesn't come from technology alone. It comes from relationships. With fire, with air, with each other. The same knowledge that built those medieval homes would one day lay the foundation for the Renaissance, where science and comfort finally learned to coexist. But before that, there was one last great chapter in the story of warmth. The age when heat became power itself. For the first time in history, warmth could be owned, and once it could be owned, it could be taken away. In the late Middle Ages, warmth became a measure of worth. It no longer belonged to nature. It belonged to people. Who controlled the fire, who had wood, who had servants to tend the embers. That was what separated the powerful from the powerless. Fire has always been sacred. Now it was political. In castles, the hearth became a sign of rank. The great hall fire was reserved for lords and their closest circle. The warmth that once drew whole communities together now radiated only toward the privileged few. Beyond that glowing circle, the air turned to shadow. Servants stood at the edge, half lit and half frozen, watching a heat they were never meant to feel. The right to warmth became codified in etiquette. To sit too close to the Lord's hearth without permission was a social trespass, a silent rebellion. Even architecture obeyed that invisible law. Halls were designed so that warmth reached the seats of power first. The temperature gradient mirrored the social hierarchy. In cities, guilds formed around the very act of burning. Charcoal makers, woodcutters, chimney sweeps. All became essential in the economy of heat. A bad harvest could mean no firewood, and no firewood meant death. Prices rose, forests shrank, and the poor turned to burning anything that would catch. Dung, straw, even thatch from their own roofs. The forests that had once seemed endless were now fading away. Europe was devouring itself to stay warm. The age of wood was ending, and no one knew it yet. Peasants in the Alps and Scandinavia knew the crisis first. They felt it in the emptiness of their hillsides, the silence of vanished trees. The very fuel of survival was disappearing, and with it, an entire way of life. That scarcity forced invention again. In colder regions, people began to perfect peat cutting, slicing blocks of compacted moss and mud from ancient bogs, drying them into a fuel that burned slow and steady. It was smoke-heavy, but efficient. Peat fires smouldered for hours, giving off an earthy smell that sank into walls, clothes, even skin. Whole villages smelled of the same peat. It was an identity you could breathe. And yet in the cities, warmth became cleaner and lonelier. The new chimneys and enclosed hearths made homes less smoky, but also more silent. Families no longer gathered shoulder to shoulder. The glow of the shared fire turned into individual fireplaces in separate rooms. People still prayed by firelight, but they prayed alone. In chasing comfort, they lost the ritual of survival. Fire had always been an event, something to be tended, feared and shared. Now it was just part of the furniture. The fire that once bound people together was being tamed into obedience. But even in the wealthiest homes, warmth was never guaranteed. Winters in the 14th and 15th centuries turned brutal. Rivers froze, crops failed, and snow lingered deep into spring. Chroniclers wrote of people found dead beside hearths that burned all night, the cold too deep to fight. In those winters, the fire's glow meant something different. Endurance. To sit by the flames wasn't luxury anymore. It was defiance. The human body had limits, but imagination didn't. That's why across Europe, the hearth began to appear in art. Paintings, woodcuts and tapestries showed families around the fire, not because it was ordinary, but because it was sacred. The hearth was now the symbol of the home itself. Meanwhile, science had started to notice the mystery. Early alchemists and natural philosophers wrote about the spirit of fire, an invisible essence that moved through air and matter. They didn't know they were describing combustion, or the beginnings of thermodynamics. To them, heat was not a property. It was a soul. And maybe in their way, they were right. Because warmth wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, an extension of human will. Every act of building a fire was a declaration that the world could be reshaped, even in its harshest form. The medieval person didn't see heat as comfort. They saw it as proof of control. That idea carried forward into the birth of the Renaissance, when comfort itself became a kind of art. Italian architects, working with open courtyards and marble, began to design rooms not just for shelter, but for climate. Fireplaces grew grander, with carved mantels and fluted chimneys, transforming warmth from necessity into aesthetic. In colder regions, the technology of tile stoves matured. The great cackelofens of Germany and Austria, now covered in colour and narrative, entire stories baked into ceramic. You could warm yourself by a battle scene, or a saint's miracle, history itself radiating heat. But beneath that beauty, the same truth remained. Every innovation in warmth came from fear. Fear of frost, fear of hunger, fear of silence. The poor still gathered in a single smoky room. The rich built private chambers with ornamental fire. But all of them were fighting the same invisible war against a cold that refused to die. Even at the height of progress, warmth was still a miracle, just dressed in finer clothes. And as Europe marched toward modernity, the fire would follow. It would shrink again into iron boxes, furnaces, and chimneys that no longer breathed. The flame that had once defined humanity would finally vanish from daily life, replaced by something invisible, efficient, and silent. But before that transformation came, the medieval world had one last lesson to give, one that even today we've barely learned. Because if the hearth taught anything, it was that warmth wasn't about heat alone. It was about connection, rhythm, and presence. It was about knowing that the same flame could burn for 1,000 years, if only someone was willing to tend it. Before there was comfort, there was the fire. Before there was love, there was its glow. And in that glow, humanity learned the first language of belonging. Every civilization, from the Norse fjords to the Italian hills, understood warmth as something more than survival. It wasn't just heat, it was memory. The fire remembered you, even when the world forgot. To sit by a medieval fire was to sit inside a heartbeat. The rhythm of its crackle matched the rhythm of breath, the pulse of the flame. The inhale of orange, the exhale of smoke, mirrored the pulse of the body. That's why so many medieval prayers were whispered beside the hearth, not at the altar. The fire was alive. You could speak to it. At the end of a long day, when frost climbed the windows and the air froze into silence, families gathered not to talk, but to listen. The fire told them what the night would bring. Soft hiss meant rain. A sharp crackle meant frost. The collapse of a burning log meant the cold was tightening outside. It was the medieval world's only forecast, the oldest weather report on Earth. In the deep of night, when even the dogs stopped barking, the fire's glow became a form of reassurance. As long as it was still there, still breathing, still alive, the world hadn't ended. But the fire also saw everything. Lovers' meetings, confessions, births and deaths, all took place beneath its light. When a man died, his chair by the hearth was left empty for days, as if the flame itself was mourning him. When a woman gave birth, her child's first sight wasn't sunlight, but firelight. In a world of cold, fire was the only witness that never slept. This was more than symbolism. It was survival psychology. The fire's light reduced fear. It drew the boundaries of safety, turning chaos into a visible world. Beyond the glow was the unknown. Wolves, spirits, the supernatural. Within it was family, warmth, and control. Every medieval home was built around that thin, golden line between terror and peace. Anthropologists call this thermal bonding, the instinct to associate heat with safety and social connection. But for the medieval person, it was deeper. They believed warmth itself carried virtue. The cold was cruel. Warmth was compassion. To share heat was to share soul. It's no coincidence that the language of fire and emotion are twins. The heart burns with love. Anger flares. Passion ignites. The idea that warmth is kindness still lingers in the way we speak. In the 13th century, theologians even wrote that hellfire was not just punishment. It was misplaced love. Warmth turned inward and corrupted. The same flame that gave life could, when twisted, destroy. It was a terrifying metaphor, but also an honest one. Comfort and danger were never far apart. The fire that healed could also reveal. In the intimacy of its glow, truth had a way of emerging. Secrets were confessed in its light. Stories were born in its shadows. The sagas of the North, tales of gods, kings and monsters, were first spoken by firelight, where words danced with flame and imagination blurred with heat haze. The glow on the storyteller's face became part of the story itself. The fire didn't just shape architecture or survival, it shaped imagination. Its flicker taught the mind how to see patterns, how to find movement in stillness. It was the first cinema screen, painting myths across the walls in light and smoke. Every jump of the flame was a scene change, every gust of wind a shift in tone. Even in monasteries where silence ruled, the fire became a kind of meditative presence. Monks would stare into the embers during long winter vigils, the rhythmic collapse of coals becoming a silent chant. Some writings from the 11th century describe the fire as the window between creation and decay. a reminder that life was only a controlled burn between two darknesses. The warmth of fire taught medieval people how to be human and how to accept that they were not gods. Because fire never belonged to anyone. You could borrow it, shape it, carry it, but never own it. It demanded attention. Neglect it, and it vanished. Feed it too much, and it devours everything. To live with fire was to live in constant negotiation, a relationship that required care, respect, and humility. In the medieval world, relationships themselves mirrored this rhythm. Marriage contracts, feasts, and peacemaking ceremonies often took place before a hearth. To bring someone to your fire meant to make them family. To turn them away was to exile them into death. Every village knew which houses kept the best fires, whose smoke rose first in the morning, whose chimney glowed longest after nightfall. The warmth of a home became its reputation. That's why when travellers knocked on a stranger's door in winter, they didn't ask for food first, they asked for fire, because sharing warmth was the purest act of mercy. It was said that a house without fire was not a house at all, only a waiting grave. The same belief still lives quietly in our world today. In candles lit for memory, in fireplaces that centre our living rooms, in our fascination with the glow of screens that mimic flame. The fire left our homes, but it never left our minds. The medieval person didn't fear the dark because they were ignorant. They feared it because they understood it. They knew that light and heat were fragile, temporary things. Every flicker was a reminder. Life itself burns. And so every evening, before sleep, they repeated the same act, tending the fire, watching the coals, listening for that faint crackle of life, continuing through the dark. The sound meant the world was still turning, that tomorrow was still promised. That ritual, small, smoky, humble, was the heartbeat of an entire civilization. By the late Middle Ages, warmth had become an empire, invisible, relentless, and hungry. The need for firewood and fuel was so vast that it began to reshape the continent itself. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were vanishing faster than anyone could imagine. The same trees that had sheltered saints and kings were being cut down, not for war, not for ships, but simply to keep people from freezing. Europe wasn't built on stone and steel, it was built on wood and fear. Every household, every monastery, every blacksmith, every bakery consumed fire. It was the engine of civilization, and that meant the forest became the medieval world's greatest battlefield. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show entire regions stripped bare, hillsides emptied of trees, valleys cleared to the bone. The great oak forests of England and France, once dense enough to block the sky, were thinned into silence. In Scandinavia, villagers had to travel miles to find decent timber. In Germany, peasants risked punishment for stealing dead branches from noble woods. Wood was life, and life was now property. Warmth has become currency. Lords began regulating who could gather fuel, when and how much. Some charged rent for the right to pick up fallen branches. Others demanded taxes on firewood rather than coins. Charcoal makers became as powerful as merchants. Blacksmiths guarded their fuel like gold. The economy of warmth divided society as much as land ever did. Peasants who couldn't afford firewood gathered heather, gorse and straw, burning what should have fed their animals or patched their roofs. In the bitterest winters they burned furniture, fences, even doors. Anything that could burn did. The environmental consequences were staggering, though few could name them. As trees fell, rivers changed course, floods grew more common, and soil turned thin and hard. The cold seemed to grow harsher with every generation. And in a cruel twist of fate, it often did. Deforestation stripped away nature's insulation. Winds blew stronger, snow lingered longer. The same forests that once softened the climate were gone, and Europe entered what historians now call the Little Ice Age. It's tempting to call that poetic justice, but to them it was terror. The more they burned, the colder the world became. Yet the medieval mind did not think in terms of ecology. They saw divine punishment. not climate feedback. Priests blamed sin, not soot. People prayed harder, built more churches, and burned even more candles to push back the darkness. Still, necessity bred invention. The scarcity of wood forced new technologies. In England, peat became the national fuel. In Central Europe, people rediscovered coal, a strange black rock that burned hotter and longer than wood, though it filled homes with choking fumes. Coal changed everything. For the first time, warmth was not bound to the forest. You could dig it from the earth. It was freedom. And danger, in equal measure. Miners called it the devil's stone. They said it burned with a deeper colour, an unnatural heat. And they weren't wrong. Coal smoke clung to everything, turning towns grey, blackening walls and choking lungs. But it was efficient. It was power condensed. It allowed cities to grow where forests had died. Coal was not just fuel. It was a promise and a curse. It promised permanence. Wood ran out, coal didn't. Firewood had to be carried on backs. Coal could be mined endlessly. But in that new abundance was a hidden loss. The personal relationship with fire, the one that defined the medieval soul, began to fade. When warmth no longer came from the hearth but from the ground, something shifted in the human psyche. The fire no longer needed tending. It didn't talk, didn't flicker, didn't breathe. It just burned. Efficient, silent, indifferent. The same shift would one day fuel the industrial world, but its roots were here, in the medieval hunger for heat. Meanwhile, the peasants adapted as they always had, through craft and care. In colder northern villages, they began to experiment with layered architecture, combining stone and wood to capture the best of both. Heavy timber beams absorbed heat, stone walls retained it. Roofs grew thicker, lower, and more curved, designed not for beauty, but for thermal flow. In France and England, homes began to sprout new appendages, bread ovens built directly into outer walls, so that their residual heat warmed adjoining rooms. The kitchen became the warmest part of the house, not just the place of food, but of life. In many records, winter births took place in kitchens for that reason alone. Even the waste heat of labour was recycled. Blacksmith forges, bathhouses and bakeries often doubled as community shelters during harsh winters. A forge could heat dozens of people for hours after the workday ended. In some towns, smiths opened their workshops at night for the poor. A quiet, unrecorded kindness that saved more lives than any sermon. Medieval people didn't just survive the cold, they turned it into a network of compassion. Heat was shared, borrowed, traded. Fire passed from house to house like a sacred loan. Neighbours reignited each other's hearths when one went out. If a traveller arrived half frozen, the first act was not to feed him, but to seat him by the fire. Even kings understood the symbolism. In royal halls, fire was both spectacle and statement. To host a great blaze was to declare prosperity. To let the hearth go dim was a sign of decline. Warmth became politics again, the currency of image and rule. But beneath all that grandeur, the truth was humbling. Fire had not changed. It was still fragile, fleeting and greedy. It still demanded wood, hands and breath. The world could evolve, but warmth remained what it had always been, the most human of all inventions. In the end, the story of medieval heat is the story of us, always reaching for light, even as we burn the world to find it. And as Europe crept towards modernity, a strange paradox appeared. People were warmer than ever before, yet further from fire than they'd ever been. The hearth that once united families and generations was fading, and with it, something ancient was disappearing quietly into the smoke. By the end of the Middle Ages, the fire no longer ruled the home, it merely lived there. The hearth had shrunk from a roaring centre of life into a polite accessory, something beautiful to look at, rather than something to survive beside. The smoke holes, the soot-stained beams, the shared beds, all began to fade. Homes grew cleaner, brighter, quieter, but also colder in a different way. They had finally defeated the cold, and lost something human in the process. The story of warmth in medieval life wasn't just about technology, it was about intimacy, about what people were willing to do for each other when the world turned to ice. In a Viking longhouse, heat came from togetherness. Every breath contributed to the same warmth. Every body shared the same air. The poor of Europe built homes where warmth meant family, where children slept in the same bed as parents, where neighbours carried fire from door to door. No one asked whose flame it was, only whether it still burned. But as the centuries turned, warmth became property. The rich no longer gathered by the same hearth as their servants. The poor no longer warmed their hands beside the same flame as the priest. Chimneys divided homes as wealth divided society. The more people could control heat, the less they shared it. When fire became efficient, it stopped being communal, and yet something in the human spirit still longed for that closeness. The imagery of warmth never left. Artists kept painting firesides. Poets kept writing about light in the dark. Even when stoves replaced open flames, people still arranged their rooms around them, as if by instinct. We are creatures of the circle, drawn to the centre, unwilling to forget the time when fire was both parent and god. In many ways, warmth itself became moral. To be called cold meant to lack compassion. To be warm-hearted meant to carry that old flame. To keep the embers of humanity alive. The language remembered what our hands had once done. By the 15th century, fire was being slowly caged. Iron grates and chimneys made it safer, cleaner, predictable. But they also made it distant. The medieval fire that had filled a room with smoke, laughter, and argument was now tamed behind stone. A servant could light it and walk away. The dialogue between flame and human was breaking. Every victory over nature leaves a silence where the struggle used to be. Modern comfort was being born, and it came at the price of awareness. Where medieval people tended warmth, we now consume it. They built a fire and listened to it breathe. We turn a dial and forget it exists. But maybe that's why the image of the medieval hearth still draws us. Somewhere in that smoky half-dark, in the sound of a single log splitting under its own weight, lies the memory of what it felt like to belong, not just to each other but to the world itself. The fire didn't only warm bodies, it warmed meaning. It gave the night shape, gave work rhythm, gave life texture. When the fire was alive, so was everything else. When it died, silence returned. The ancient silence that still waits outside every door, no matter the century. The Middle Ages never really ended, they just moved indoors. Every winter we lived their echo. We close our windows, chase away the cold, and build small rituals of light to remind ourselves we're still here. The candle, the hearth, the glow of a screen, all of them descendants of the same primal need, to make the dark a little smaller. The medieval person would have understood that better than anyone. They would have seen in our cities of glass and heat the same fragile hope they once held over their embers. That warmth could outlast the night. They would have known that it wouldn't, not forever. And that's why they kept tending the fire, because warmth to them was never just about survival. It was faith made visible. Proof that even in a world built of frost, the human heart still burns. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the world was beginning to thaw, not in temperature, but in imagination. People no longer wanted to simply survive the cold, they wanted to master it. The medieval mind had built homes as shields. The Renaissance mind began to build them as instruments. Architects started to think of heat not just as a gift of fire, but as a principle, something that could be directed, multiplied, even hidden in walls. Fire was no longer worshipped. It was studied. In Italy, Leonardo da Vinci sketched plans for ventilated chimneys, airflows, and self-regulating stoves. His notes read like the diary of someone trying to perfect an ancient prayer. Elsewhere, builders began crafting fireplaces that pulled air from outside rather than stealing it from within, creating the first balance between flame and oxygen, a whisper of modern engineering centuries ahead of its time. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, the mastery of the Catchalofen reached its peak. The great ceramic stoves grew into towers of warmth, each tile hand-painted, each curve designed to absorb and radiate heat with mathematical precision. You could walk into a room at dawn, long after the fire had died, and still feel the ghost of yesterday's warmth on your skin. For the first time, warmth outlived the night, but with progress came distance. The open hearth that had defined the medieval home, smoky, loud and alive, began to disappear. It was replaced by clean enclosed systems that worked quietly in the background. No sparks, no crackle, no presence. The fire no longer demanded attention. It simply obeyed. The change was subtle, but profound. People no longer gathered around the flame. They gathered away from it. In chairs, in studies, in solitude. The hearth had once been a circle. Now it was a corner. Humanity was getting warmer, but less human. And yet the lessons of the medieval world lingered. In the north, the traditions of the longhouse, earth insulation, communal living, low ceilings and central heating, influenced architecture for centuries. Modern Scandinavian design still carries their ghosts. Wide communal spaces, layered materials, warmth shared through proximity rather than extravagance. The wisdom of survival became the art of simplicity. In the castles and manors of Europe, the balance between display and comfort evolved into what we now call domestic architecture. The medieval battle between warmth and smoke became the foundation for every modern home, a design challenge still being solved 600 years later. Even the physics of the medieval fire survives in your world today. The way air moves through a vent, the way a furnace breathes, the shape of a chimney's throat, all descend from those same smoky experiments in longhouses, castles and peasant huts. Every modern radiator, every central heating system is a quiet echo of medieval invention. But the psychology of heat, that part didn't evolve. It merely changed shape. We no longer fear the cold, but we still chase the same light. The glow of a fireplace became the glow of a candle. The candle became the glow of a bulb. The bulb became the glow of a screen. Each one offered comfort, connection, and illusion. A small circle of light to hold back the dark. We still gather around our fires. We've just changed their shape. They no longer burn wood. They burn electricity, pixels and attention. But the instinct remains the same. Come closer, stay warm, stay human. If a peasant from the 13th century could step into your living room and see the soft light of a television flickering against your walls, they would recognise it instantly. They'd sit down beside it, stretch their hands toward it and whisper, "It's warm." The miracle of warmth never changed, only its disguise did. The story of medieval heat is not a story about the past, it's a story about endurance. Every spark from that era still burns in our technology, our language, our rituals. We may no longer carry embers wrapped in moss, but we carry the memory of doing so. Every comfort we have was born from discomfort. Every home we build stands on centuries of smoke. The Vikings, the peasants, the masons, and the monks all left fingerprints in your walls. Their struggles against the cold are the reason you can sit in silence tonight and not hear the wind screaming through your ceiling. They gave shape to comfort before comfort had a name. And though we no longer share fires, we share something older, the memory of them. Because warmth, in the end, is not about temperature. It's about connection. It's about the invisible bridge between the body and the soul, between the living and the dead, between those who once huddled beneath wool and those who now rest beneath light. The fire they built never died. It just changed form, waiting for someone to notice that it's still burning. You could always tell who made the fire, not the one who lit it, but the one who built it. The difference was everything. A careless hand made a blaze that roared too quickly, wasting wood and breath. A skilled hand made a flame that lasted through the night, a fire that burned as if it understood patience. In the medieval world, those hands, the quiet architects of warmth, rarely left their names behind, but their work kept millions alive. History remembers kings and knights, It forgets the people who kept them from freezing. Every fire began long before the spark. In the forest, charcoal burners worked deep among the trees, cutting logs in precise sizes, stacking them into great domed mounds, and sealing them with turf. Then they waited, days, sometimes weeks, as the slow, controlled smothering of flame transformed wood into black fuel that burned hotter and longer than any log. It was a dangerous, lonely trade. One mistake, one draught of air, and the mound would explode into useless ash. These men lived in smoke. Their skin turned grey, their lungs black. Their clothes smelled of earth and ember. Villagers rarely saw them except when they came down from the hills to sell their loads. Half-mythic figures, smelling of hell but carrying salvation. Without them, no forge would work. No hearth would stay lit through winter. The blacksmiths in turn were the true scientists of medieval fire. Their forges were the hottest spaces in the known world. Miniature suns hidden behind wooden doors. They learned to control air with bellows, to balance flame and metal like a living equation. What they discovered about heat and transformation laid the groundwork for every later invention of combustion and chemistry. Every tool, every weapon, every coin of the Middle Ages began as a prayer to fire. The smith's mastery of flame was so respected that people whispered of magic. They believed the forge was a holy place where earth and spirit met. Some even thought blacksmiths could heal illness, because they understood both burning and cooling, the two laws of life itself. Inside homes, the mastery of heat took another form, one practiced mostly by women. The tending of the hearth was not just domestic labour, it was environmental control, food preservation, medicine and technology in one. A woman who knew her fire could turn scraps into meals, purify water, and keep sickness at bay with the right balance of smoke and ash. She could tell by scent when a log was ready or when the air in the room had turned too stale. The medieval hearthkeeper was part alchemist, part engineer, part guardian of life. It was the one place in society where knowledge moved silently but powerfully through generations. From mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice. Recipes for fuel mixtures, ash-based cleaning solutions, even smoke cures for wounds were passed in whispers, not books. The hearth was the first laboratory, and women were its scientists. Their innovations shaped not only survival, but culture. The way medieval bread was baked, the way beer was brewed, the way meat was smoked. All depended on the fine management of heat. Whole cuisines were born from the same patience that kept the family alive through the night. In monasteries, the art of heat took on another face. Monks became Europe's first thermal engineers. They experimented with furnace designs for cooking, pottery, and glassmaking. Some monasteries built elaborate heating tunnels that directed smoke beneath floors or through walls, warming multiple rooms from a single fire. You could walk into a Cistercian cloister in winter and feel warmth without seeing its source. A miracle of stone and airflow. The holiest men of the age had unknowingly invented central heating. Their systems were not built for comfort but for function. To dry herbs, keep ink from freezing, or stop damp from ruining manuscripts. Yet in doing so, they created the blueprint for every, later, architectural innovation. Heat had become invisible, integrated, and intelligent. And still, for most of Europe, warmth remained a battle fought by hand. The tile makers of Germany and Bohemia, whose ovens would become the cachalofens, worked with almost divine precision. They tested clay mixtures, firing temperatures, glaze thickness, not for beauty, but for heat retention. A perfect tile stove could radiate warmth for half a day after its fire had died. That single advantage meant fewer trees cut, fewer lives lost to cold. They didn't call it sustainability, they called it survival. Even the builders of humble cottages carried that genius. They learned to orient homes toward the sun, to angle roof lines for wind, to pack south-facing walls with thicker clay. These weren't conscious scientific decisions, they were instincts sharpened by centuries of observation. The medieval builder looked at light and shadow, the way a sailor looked at stars, for guidance. They didn't draw blueprints, they read the weather. A well-built home could feel 5 degrees warmer than its neighbour simply because the door faced east, catching morning heat before the frost returned. That knowledge passed by gesture and memory, not written in treatises, but in calloused hands shaping earth and wood. In a way, the architects of warmth were philosophers. They worked with the most fragile of all materials, not stone, not wood, but air itself. And they learned how to shape it. To them, warmth wasn't abstract. It was personal. It had weight, texture, and morality. A good home was one that held warmth faithfully, like a soul that refused to leave the body. We remember the cathedrals, the fortresses, the wars, but the truest monuments of the Middle Ages were invisible. They were the pockets of heat that held through the night, the breaths that turned a room from death to life. Every civilization begins with a wall, but it survives because of a fire. Without the nameless hands that built, fed, and understood that fire, no empire could have stood, no kingdom endured. Their legacy isn't written in books or stone. It's written in warmth, in every home that still holds the echo of their craft. In the far north, the world itself was the enemy. The cold there didn't simply bite, it crushed. It sank into bone, whispered through the walls, and waited for the weak to slow down. The people who survived it weren't just strong, they were inventive in ways few cultures have ever been. The north didn't conquer the cold, it befriended it. The Vikings didn't see warmth as a luxury, they saw it as a covenant, a pact between human endurance and the indifference of nature. Fire was sacred, but it wasn't separate from life. It lived inside the home, the body, the breath. Step into a Viking longhouse and you'll understand why. It's not the grand hall of Hollywood myth. It's darker, lower, denser. The roof droops close to the smoke, the air thick with the smell of tar, wool, and sweat. The fire burns along the centre of the floor, glowing between stones that stretch down the length of the building. Every inch of that structure has one purpose: to trap heat and to hold it. A Viking home was less a house and more a living machine of warmth. Its builders knew how air moved. The walls were layered. Turf, timber, moss, earth. The layers trapped moisture, sealed gaps, and created microclimates inside the structure. Smoke gathered beneath the rafters in a low, warm haze, pressing downward and thickening the air. The ceiling was black with centuries of soot, not filth, but insulation. Even the doorways were designed for survival. They were small, low, and set into the leeward side of the house, where wind could not force its way in. Each time someone entered, they had to crouch, a small bow before the home itself, whether they meant it or not. The floor was packed clay mixed with ash, absorbing warmth from the fire. Sleeping benches lined the walls, stacked with straw and fur, slightly raised so that people slept just above the cold air currents. It was an ecosystem of human ingenuity, shaped entirely by the climate that tried to erase them. Their homes didn't fight the cold, they worked with it. The longhouse accepted smoke, damp and darkness as allies, not enemies. A smoky ceiling sealed heat in. Damp earth absorbed energy by day and released it by night. Darkness itself protects warmth by slowing heat loss through light openings. Every discomfort was part of the design. Archaeologists have found that these homes maintained surprisingly stable temperatures, even in Arctic winters. Inside it could stay just above freezing, when outside it dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. That difference meant survival. But the Viking relationship with heat went beyond architecture. It was spiritual. In Norse cosmology, fire and ice weren't opposites. They were the first parents of creation. From their meeting came the world itself. Every time a Viking built a fire, they were reenacting the birth of life from chaos. They understood cold not as evil, but as a test of worth. Warmth was something you earned, something that proved your courage. In sagas, heroes didn't boast of comfort. They boasted of endurance. To endure the cold was to be closer to the gods. Their mythology reflects it. The god Loki was born of flame, yet he lived among frost giants. The world would end not in fire alone, but in Fimbul winter, an endless freeze that would test even the gods. For Vikings, warmth was divine, but cold was sacred too. You couldn't have one without respecting the other. That duality shaped their daily life. When a Viking awoke, his first thought was of the hearth. The woman of the house, often the matriarch, guarded the fire overnight, banking it under ash so it could breathe again by dawn. She was the keeper of continuity, the literal flame of the family's line. To let the hearth die was to bring shame. Some sagas speak of households whose fires went cold, a mark of failure so deep it needed ritual cleansing. In that sense, the Viking hearth wasn't just a furnace, it was a soul that demanded honour. Fire was blood, the hearth was its heart. Communal life revolved around that centre. Warriors returned from raids to warm themselves under the same smoke that blackened their childhood. Storytellers, the skalds, recited sagas by the light of those same embers, weaving tales of gods and ancestors, as sparks drifted toward the roof hole like ascending souls. Even in death, the symbolism endured. Funeral pyres weren't random acts of destruction. They were the ultimate act of transformation. The same fire that fed you, warmed you, and kept you alive now carried you to the next world. And yet, for all their reverence, the Vikings were scientists of necessity. They experimented constantly. In Greenland and Iceland, where wood was scarce, they built turf houses, thick earthen dwellings that looked like natural hills from the outside. Inside, they were remarkably efficient. With inner timber frames, sod walls, and smoke vents angled for wind direction, they could stay warm for months with minimal fuel. In Iceland, some homes were even built near geothermal vents, harnessing the natural heat of the earth itself. 1,000 years before modern geothermal heating, Viking settlers had already discovered how to live with the planet's warmth rather than fight it. When others fled the cold, the Norse turned it into a resource. They burned dried seaweed for fuel. They lined clothing with moss. They used animal fat as both light and insulation. To live in that environment required imagination as much as strength. But the genius of the Viking approach wasn't only in design, it was in mindset. They accepted the limits of comfort. They didn't build against nature, they built within it. Their homes, their rituals, their very sense of identity were all tuned to the rhythm of heat and cold. That acceptance gave them resilience that no empire could replicate. When other civilizations froze and faltered, the North endured, not through luxury, but through balance. Their lesson is simple, and it still speaks to us across the centuries. Warmth is not a product, it's a relationship. The Vikings didn't chase comfort, they mastered endurance, and though their fires have long gone out, their designs still whisper in the cold architecture of the North. In every log cabin, every sod roof, every home built to outlast winter. They understood something that modern people often forget. The world doesn't owe you warmth, but if you respect it, if you build, adapt and share, it will give it back. That was the Viking covenant. And in their long, smoky halls, with the wind howling beyond the walls and the fire glowing low, that covenant burned for generations. By the late 1500s, the cold no longer terrified people the way it once had, or so they thought. The fire that once ruled life had been tamed, trained to behave, confined behind carved stone and polished iron. But in that triumph was the seed of a quiet loss. Comfort began as survival that forgot its name. Where once warmth had been a miracle shared by all, now it became a mark of refinement. In castles and rising townhouses, fire was no longer just heat, it was design. Builders carved mantles like altars. Wealthy families commissioned artisans to decorate hearths with marble, cherubs and gold. A blaze now spoke of class as much as courage. But the air around those flames was different. Too clean, too separate. The new chimneys and sealed flues made homes safer, but they stripped the room of its breath. The medieval house had been a living organism, noisy and smoky but alive. The Renaissance home was beautiful and dead. When warmth became effortless, people stopped listening to it. It no longer spoke in crackles and sighs. It hummed softly through metal grates, predictable and dull. Fire had become obedient, and in that obedience, it lost its soul. The psychology of heat was changing too. Where medieval life saw warmth as communal, the modern world began to see it as personal. Each room had its own fire, each person their own comfort. Privacy was born from warmth. Families began to scatter through their homes instead of huddling together. Writers of the time noticed it first. The intimacy of the hearth, the shared laughter, the storytelling, the closeness, was fading. People began to speak of loneliness for the first time. In letters, noble women wrote about feeling cold in chambers of heat. The paradox was already forming. They were warmer than ever, and yet somehow more alone. Meanwhile, in the streets outside, the poor still lived in the echo of the Middle Ages. They crowded into one-room cottages or tenements, often sharing a single hearth with multiple families. The contrast was brutal. Within the same city, one fire roared in gold, while another sputtered in ash. Warmth had become the first true divide between classes. Coal was everywhere now. It burned hotter, lasted longer, but it blackened everything it touched. The air of London, Paris, and Nuremberg grew thick with soot. The world was trading one form of survival for another, a warmer death. Yet to those who lived through it, the new fires felt almost divine. The ability to summon heat from a rock pulled from the earth must have seemed like sorcery. In some homes, coal replaced wood so completely that children grew up never knowing the smell of a log fire, the smell that had followed humanity since the Stone Age. The change was invisible but immense. People no longer tended fires, they fed them. No longer companions, flames became tools. The fire was no longer part of the family. It was the servant who never spoke. Progress made fire easier to control and harder to love. But warmth had always carried meaning beyond heat. When people stopped sharing it, society itself cooled. You can see it in the art of the age. Paintings of solitary readers beside small hearths, thinkers staring into single candles, interiors where silence replaced conversation. The domestic warmth of the medieval world had turned inward. In literature, the fire became a symbol of thought, not community. The philosopher beside the flame replaced the family around it. The age of survival gave birth to the age of introspection. And yet, the human longing for the circle, for the glow, the togetherness, never truly died. The tavern replaced the hall. The coffee house replaced the feast. The same instinct to gather near warmth simply changed venues. Every public house with a roaring fireplace was a small rebellion against isolation, a defiant echo of the medieval hearth. Even in faith, warmth evolved. The church candles grew brighter and more numerous. Cathedrals glowed with hundreds of flames, not for heat, but for presence. The flame remained the symbol of spirit, a reminder that even in a world of stone and progress, light was still fragile. Fire had lost its danger, but kept its meaning. It was no longer the master of life and death, but it still carried memory. That's why people still built fireplaces long after they stopped needing them. Even in cities heated by coal furnaces and steam pipes, the hearth remained. Decorative, empty, but there. A hollow monument to what had once been the centre of everything. By the 1700s, engineers were designing flues and vents that carried heat to multiple rooms. The first primitive central heating systems appeared in palaces and universities. They were triumphs of logic and defeats of ritual. The fire no longer needed a keeper. But in removing the keeper, something essential vanished. The endless conversation between human and flame, the listening, the tending, the slow exchange of effort and reward, was gone. For thousands of years, fire has taught humanity patience. Then we stopped learning. Now warmth came without thought. You didn't have to build it, protect it, or earn it. And that ease began to reshape the way people saw the world. Comfort became an expectation. Expectation became entitlement. The age of survival had ended. The age of convenience had begun. But every time comfort wins, endurance forgets. And the lessons written in soot and smoke, the ingenuity of peasants, The wisdom of Vikings, the prayers whispered beside dying embers, began to fade into history. Still, somewhere, the memory lingered. In the old cottages, the turf houses, the blackened beams of forgotten longhouses. In the quiet villages, where people still banked fires beneath ash. And in winter, when the snow pressed against the glass and the light failed early, people still felt it. That ancient pull toward the centre, toward the glow. Even in modern homes, the hearth still calls, not for heat, but for memory. Because no matter how far humanity travels from the dark, part of it still waits beside the fire, listening to the wind, remembering the night the world was young and cold. The story of warmth doesn't end with invention. It ends with silence. When the world grew bright, when homes filled with light that needed no tending, when warmth came at the turn of a valve, the silence arrived. The kind of silence that follows when something ancient has finished speaking. Every fire that once needed a hand to live now burns without one. The hum of a radiator, the invisible pulse of an electric coil. They don't ask for devotion. They don't flicker when you breathe, or hiss when you whisper. They don't make you stop and listen. They just exist, mute and perfect. But in that perfection, something human went missing. Medieval warmth was imperfect. It stung your eyes, smoked your hair, and made the air thick with life. It forced you to sit together, to share, to wait. Every moment by the fire was an act of attention. You had to feed it. You had to care. And that care was what made you alive. The people of the Middle Ages didn't think about comfort the way we do, because they didn't separate it from connection. A fire meant family. A hearth meant faith. Heat meant love, patience, endurance. To them, warmth wasn't what you had. It was what you gave. Every ember was a story of effort. The wood cut in the frost, the coals carried from the forge, the hands blistered from tending. Every flame was proof that life was still being fought for. We've forgotten how to fight for it. When the world outside our windows turns cold, we don't gather anymore. We adjust the thermostat. The warmth comes instantly, obediently, unearned. It feels the same, but it isn't. It has no memory, no ritual, no soul. And yet when the power goes out, when the room grows dark and quiet, instinct wakes up. We light candles, we draw close, we watch shadows move again. Something ancient stirs in our blood, the old rhythm of fear and awe. That moment, that breath, is the oldest inheritance in the world. The fire never left us, we just stopped seeing it. It lives in the light of a screen, in the pulse of a city at night, in the glow of a window seen from a snowy street. It lives in the comfort we seek and the company we crave. Even now we arrange our lives around light, around the modern hearths of civilization. Cafes, living rooms, campfires, churches. Every spark of electricity is a whisper of that first stolen flame, that moment when a trembling human hand reached into the dark and refused to let go. The people of the Middle Ages carried that defiance every day. Every strike of flint, every breath into tinder was a declaration that they were still here, still warm, still human. We live surrounded by what they could only dream of. And yet the same question remains. What keeps you warm? Is it the heat in the room, or the presence beside you? Is it the comfort of a home, or the memory of those who built it? Because warmth, in the end, isn't fire at all. It's the fragile bridge between the living and the cold. We learned to master fire, but the fire was always teaching us. It taught us patience. It taught us about the community. It taught us reverence for what fades and can be rekindled. It taught us that life itself is a flame. Brief, trembling, but unstoppable, as long as someone tends it. That's what the people of the Middle Ages knew. That's why they gathered every night beneath smoke and soot, whispering stories while the wind clawed at their walls. They didn't need to name what they were doing. They were keeping the world alive. And so are you. Every time you choose connection over indifference, patience over comfort, care over convenience, you are tending the same fire. It's the one that began in a Viking hall, in a peasant's hut, in a monk's stone kitchen. It's the one that still burns in every act of endurance, every shared glance in the dark, every story told beside a light that flickers. The fire is eternal, but only if we remember to look at it. So when night falls and you feel the cold closing in, don't take your warmth for granted. Sit still for a moment. Listen. You'll hear the same sound they heard 1,000 years ago. That soft, steady crackle of life refusing to die. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel the truth they lived by. That the greatest invention in history was not the sword, or the wheel, or the crown, but the simple, fragile, beautiful act of keeping a flame alive. Long before science had a name, people were already experimenting with warmth. They didn't call it physics or chemistry, they called it survival. But in their struggle to master heat, they uncovered truths that would one day define the modern world. They didn't measure warmth, they worshipped it. To the medieval mind, heat wasn't just a force, it was a spirit, something alive, invisible, divine. You couldn't see it directly, only its effects. A glowing coal, a steaming breath, a loaf of bread turned from dough into life. They believed heat was the breath of creation itself, the same energy that moved the stars. This belief wasn't blind faith, it was an observation. In monasteries and workshops, ordinary people were quietly discovering the science of temperature centuries before anyone named it. In a small Benedictine abbey in France, a monk watched how candlelight flickered differently on cold mornings than on warm ones. He noted how smoke twisted tighter when the air was dry, how flame grew lazy in dampness. He didn't know about oxygen or pressure, but he knew the world breathed. To them, the fire wasn't in the wood, it was in the air around it. That realization changed everything. In the forges of the 12th and 13th centuries, blacksmiths learned to control that breath. By pumping air into their coals, they made fire hotter than nature ever intended. They melted iron into submission. Without knowing it, they were inventing thermodynamics, the science of controlled energy. They saw how metal changed the colour with temperature. Red, orange, yellow, white. The colours became their thermometer, centuries before glass tubes of mercury. They learned that every shade told a secret about the world's hidden order, that heat was not chaos, but precision. And from those fires, an idea began to form, that warmth was not random. It could be guided, measured, perfected. In Oxford, a friar named Roger Bacon wrote of the nature of flame and air. He believed heat was a divine echo, the material world's memory of heaven. He experimented with lenses and mirrors, focusing sunlight to ignite tinder, imagining a future where light itself could be shaped. He was not alone. In Persia, centuries earlier, the great scholar Al-Razi had described experiments with evaporation and boiling, studying how water turned to vapour and returned as rain. He saw fire as the agent of transformation, the boundary between life and death, solid and spirit. While Europe prayed to fire, others were already taking its measure. The Islamic Golden Age preserved and advanced the world's understanding of heat. Alchemists in Baghdad built furnaces with vented chimneys, adjustable airflow, and ceramic insulation. They refined metals, brewed medicines, and even designed early thermostats. Clay bulbs that expanded when heated, opening and closing vents automatically. To them, balance was divine. Too much fire destroyed, too little wasted potential. It was a metaphor for everything, the human soul, the state, the cosmos itself. In Europe, this wisdom slowly filtered through monasteries and travellers' tales. But even without books, craftsmen everywhere were performing their own experiments. The baker, who knew how to judge an oven's readiness by holding his palm near the opening. The brewer, who learned the exact warmth yeast needed to live. The glassblower, who could tell by sound when molten sand had turned to liquid light. These weren't guesses, they were empirical truths, written in muscle memory. Before science lived in books, it lived in hands. And yet medieval people never separated the physical from the spiritual. Fire was still sacred, even as they learned to command it. Every discovery carried humility, because every mistake could still kill. A single spark could undo a city. London, Paris, and Lubeck all burned in infernos that swallowed thousands. Each tragedy was seen not as an accident, but as moral failure, the punishment for pride in trying to control what only gods should wield. Still, humanity kept testing its limits. Alchemists locked themselves in stone laboratories, watching crucibles glow red, waiting for revelation. They were trying to turn base metals into gold, but in truth, they were studying transformation itself. They learned that heat changed everything it touched. Wood into ash, ore into steel, flesh into spirit. They didn't call it combustion, they called it transmutation. And in their obsession, they stumbled upon the first insights of chemistry, that fire consumes, air feeds, and balance preserves. The age of miracles was ending, and the age of mastery was beginning. By the 15th century, a quiet revolution was already underway. The blacksmith's forge, the monk's kitchen, and the alchemist's furnace had all merged into one vision. That heat was not mystery, but law. Something that could be understood, predicted, repeated. But even as that understanding grew, the awe never vanished. The greatest minds of the Middle Ages, from Hildegard of Bingen to Albertus Magnus, wrote of divine warmth, the inner fire of creation that lived in all things. To them, the heart's beating was a reflection of cosmic heat, the soul's energy burning through flesh. In monasteries, monks described mystical warmth felt during prayer, as if God himself had entered their bodies. They didn't see that as superstition. They saw it as evidence that spirit and matter were one flame. The medieval world didn't need to separate science from faith. It saw them burning from the same source. When a blacksmith forged a sword, when a baker tended bread, when a monk lit a candle, each act carried the same reverence. Each was a conversation with the universe, a negotiation between creation and destruction. The fire had taught them everything they knew: how to build, how to heal, how to destroy. But more than anything, it had taught them how to wonder. They didn't measure their success by numbers or formulas. They measured it by survival, by beauty, by the simple fact that life continued. And that is what made their science human. They didn't invent warmth, they became its students. Long before laboratories and textbooks, long before engines and furnaces, people had already mastered the first true science of the world, the art of keeping life alive through the cold. They called it craft. We call it civilization. There was no such thing as an ordinary fire in the Middle Ages. Every flame, no matter how small, belonged to something greater, to heaven, to hell, or to the fragile line between them. Every fire burned twice, once for the body, once for the soul. For medieval people, warmth wasn't only survival, it was salvation. The same heat that baked bread and melted iron was also the fire that purified sin, the light that guided saints, the flame that could damn or deliver. Step into a cathedral at midnight, and you would feel it. Not just the chill of stone, but the weight of light. Hundreds of candles flickered in the darkness, their smoke climbing toward vaulted ceilings. The air trembled with wax and prayer. That glow wasn't decoration. It was theology made visible. Each candle symbolized a living soul. To light one was to call divine attention. To keep it burning was an act of faith. And to see it die out, that was an omen. In an age of cold and silence, light was the proof that God still watched. The church became the keeper of that light. Monks rose in the frozen pre-dawn hours to relight wicks that had guttered overnight. The eternal flame burned before altars as a sign that heaven's warmth would never fail. In monasteries from Ireland to Hungary, whole schedules revolved around fire. But it wasn't just sacred, it was also dangerous. Too much flame and a church could vanish in minutes. Fire didn't care for sanctity. It consumed scripture as easily as straw. Many monks saw this not as an accident, but as warning. The same gift that gave life could take it away. That duality became the beating heart of medieval theology. The closer you get to divine fire, the greater the risk of being burned. The sermons of the age spoke of two flames, one of love, one of judgment. the fire of the Holy Spirit that filled believers with warmth, and the fire of damnation that tormented the faithless. People prayed to feel the first and feared to feel the second, and sometimes in their prayers they felt both. Saints wrote of ecstatic visions where their hearts blazed with inner heat, a sensation they believed to be divine presence. Hildegard of Bingen described it as the living light of God, warm and fierce as the breath of creation. To her, the body's warmth was not a weakness. It was evidence that spirit and flesh shared the same flame. Heaven was warm, hell was hot. That difference may sound small, but to them it meant everything. Warmth was comfort, closeness, communion. Heat was punishment, isolation, despair. In art, hell was always painted as a place of fire without light, the cruel, smothering glow that burns but never warms. The contrast haunted medieval imagination. Painters, sculptors, and poets filled their works with flames. The tongues of the spirit descending, the fires of martyrdom, the burning towers of apocalypse. Fire was beauty and terror in equal measure. And so in daily life, people treated it with a kind of reverent fear. A candle was never left unattended. A hearth was never walked past without a small bow. To spill water on a flame intentionally was to risk misfortune. The fire was alive, and it was remembered. Every hearth was a holy thing, even if it sat in a peasant's hut. The church understood that power. It used flame to teach morality. Candles for baptism, torches for processions, bonfires for feast days. Every ritual reinforced the same truth, the balance between destruction and devotion. But the same symbol that sanctified could also condemn. The fire of faith became the fire of punishment. Heretics burned at the stake under the same sky that glowed above cathedral candles. The Inquisition called it purification. To them it wasn't cruelty, it was theology. Fire cleansing the soul before judgment. The crowd that watched didn't just see death, they saw a lesson. It was the darkest paradox of the age. The flame that symbolized grace also delivered terror. Humanity's oldest ally has become its cruelest judge. Even so, people couldn't let it go. The bonfires that marked holy festivals like Easter or Midsummer survived even through plague and war. The church tried to baptize these pagan rites, calling them new fire ceremonies. But everyone knew their roots were older. When villagers lit torches on the hills at solstice, they weren't celebrating doctrine. They were keeping a promise. The promise that light would return, that the world, no matter how dark, would remember to be warm again. And beneath all the sermons and punishments, the old faith still flickered. The belief that fire itself was sacred, beyond ownership. That it belonged not to God, not to church, but to life. Even the architecture of belief revolved around heat. The holy oil lamps that burned before relics were never allowed to go out. Some were said to have burned for centuries, drawing pilgrims from distant lands to see God's unending fire. In those flames they didn't just see light, they saw defiance. To light a candle in the dark was the boldest act a human could make. And that act, repeated by peasants, priests and wanderers for centuries, became the foundation of Western spirituality. Not the words, not the dogma, but the gesture. The small, trembling light held against infinite cold. Because what faith really meant in the Middle Ages wasn't comfort or certainty. It was endurance. The same endurance that kept hearths burning through endless winters. The same endurance that made a mother stay awake to guard the coals. The same endurance that made a monk rise from his bed before dawn to light the altar again. They were all part of one ritual, one shared defiance of the dark. And though time would change the prayers and the architecture, the heart of it never died. The fire in the church and the fire in the home, they were one and the same. Each flame said the same thing in a different language. I am here. I am alive. I will not go out. The fire was never just a symbol of faith. It was faith itself. And as centuries passed, that faith grew quieter. But it didn't vanish. It still burns in the candles of vigil, in the hearths of mountain villages, in the lamps of cathedrals. The light may be smaller now, but it still carries the same ancient meaning, that warmth is proof of hope. The people of the Middle Ages didn't just believe in fire, they believed like fire, steady, bright, and unafraid of the dark. The story of warmth was never only about the past, it has always been about us, about what we remember, what we've forgotten, and what we still carry without knowing. We no longer fear the cold, but maybe we should, because the cold still waits. It's out there, beyond the hum of the walls, beyond the glow of the screens. We've built fortresses of comfort around ourselves, sealed tight against every chill. But the world outside hasn't changed. It's still the same vast, patient dark that surrounded the first fire 100,000 years ago. Once we lived in rhythm with that darkness. We listened to it, answered it. We knew its moods. We knew that warmth was temporary, and that made it sacred. Now warmth is constant, and that makes it forgettable. Look around any city at night. The lights blaze all hours, the windows glow in endless rows, every building hums with hidden heat. It feels safe, invincible. But inside that glow, people sit alone. We've never been warmer or lonelier. Our ancestors didn't have much, but they had each other, pressed shoulder to shoulder beside a single flame. The fire wasn't just light. It was the space where stories were told, where fears were named, where hearts softened. We've replaced that with electricity and distraction, but not with connection. We no longer share fire. We share signals. And the light we look at now doesn't look back. It's strange how our inventions mimic what we lost. The flicker of a screen echoes the flicker of a flame. The scrolling light across a phone in a dark room feels hauntingly familiar. We still gather around it. We still stare into its glow, but we no longer speak. The modern fire gives no warmth, only reflection. The fire isn't gone. It's digitized, and like the old flame, it consumes time, attention, breath. It burns through our days and nights, yet leaves no ashes to remind us of what's gone. But deep down, the old rhythm remains. When the lights fail, when a storm cuts the power, when everything falls quiet, we still know what to do. We reach for matches, for candles, for the small trembling light that once meant life. We remember. That instinct, that sudden ancient calm, is the proof of how deeply the fire lives inside us. It's not nostalgia, it's recognition. We've always been creatures of warmth. Studies today even prove what our ancestors already knew, that humans seek heat not just for comfort, but for trust. When we're cold, we feel more isolated. When we're warm, we're more generous, more open. Our bodies tell the same story our history does, that warmth is empathy made physical. Every civilization burns in its own way. The Vikings burned for endurance. The monks burned for faith. The peasants burned for survival. And we burn for comfort. But all those fires are the same flame in different hands. The only question is what we're willing to feed it with. The medieval person tended their fire every night because they knew what it cost to lose it. We have forgotten that cost. We assume warmth will always be there, that the sun will rise, the power will stay, the air will hum. But that certainty dulls us. It makes us forget what warmth truly means. Not the absence of cold, but the triumph over it. You can only appreciate light if you've known the dark. When a Viking mother banked her hearth for the night, she wasn't just saving coals. She was passing on a message to the next morning. We endured. When a monk lit the chapel lamp before dawn, he wasn't just performing duty, he was reminding the world that faith still breathed. When a peasant crouched over a tiny spark in a winter storm, he was keeping alive the same story you live by now. This life still burns. The modern world rarely lets us feel that anymore. We live at room temperature, untouched by struggle, disconnected from the elements that once defined existence. But the memory of the flame still shapes us. It's in the way we seek light at night, the way we gather in warmth when grief comes, the way we look for someone's hand when the world feels cold. Warmth is how humanity remembers itself. The people of the Middle Ages understood that better than we do. They didn't have the means to escape nature, so they learned to live inside it. Their fires weren't conveniences, they were promises. Every spark was a vow that the night would not win, that the human story would go on. And now in our heated rooms we carry that same inheritance. We don't sit by the hearth anymore, but we still light candles in mourning, bonfires in celebration, lamps in prayer. The gesture remains, the meaning remains. Because no matter how advanced we become, the first and last thing we will ever need is warmth, of body, of spirit, of one another. The flame doesn't care about time, only that someone still guards it. So when you look at a fire, a campfire, a candle, or even the faint orange glow of a city window on a winter night, remember what it means, that every civilization, every family, every soul that ever lived fought to keep that same light alive. The fire is the memory of everything we've been, and everything we hope to remain. And though the cold will always return, the fire always answers. The story of fire didn't end at the hearth, it changed its voice. What once cracked and whispered in dark rooms began to roar behind brick and iron. The ember became a furnace, the hearth became a workshop. The glow that once shaped a family now shaped a continent. When we learned to cage fire, we stopped fearing it and started becoming it. At first, nothing looked different. A few larger kilns, taller chimneys, stronger bellows, but each change was a step away from the fragile living flame of the home, towards something heavier, steadier, industrial. The same instincts that taught a monk to bank members and a peasant to seal drafts now taught builders to feed air, trap heat, and hold it until stone itself began to sing. Ironmasters found the limits of wood, then pushed past them. Charcoal drove early blast furnaces, and the old forest chemistry, slow, careful, human, met its opposite. Scale. Heat that once warmed bodies now melted mountains. Entire valleys were given to fire. The glow of smelting lit the night like an artificial dawn, and people began to speak of work hours by the colour of the sky. The hearth had been human. The furnace was a new species of weather. What changed was not only temperature, but time. The medieval day obeyed light. The industrial day obeyed heat. The furnace didn't sleep. Its rhythm became the rhythm of towns. Bells called to prayer once. Steam whistles called to shift change 10 times as loud. The social geometry rearranged around brick stacks. Houses angled for soot. Laundry for wind. Children for cough. But the mind is thrilled by it. The same fascination that drew people to a winter fire drew crowds to foundries. To watch iron pour like sunlight in a liquid state. To see sand give way and shape a wheel or a cannon in a heartbeat. The miracle of transformation that a blacksmith held in his hands now happened by the ton. Coal became the new covenant. It was the forest compressed into geologic memory. Patience burned all at once. With it, the old economy of warmth broke open. You could live in a place with no trees and still have heat. You could build a city where winter would have killed one in a century, and you could drive heat into motion. Fire discovered its legs when we gave it steam. The steam engine turned warmth into work. It took what a hearth did for the body and made it move ships, pull oar, spin thread. Heat was no longer a condition. It was a currency that could be spent anywhere, in any season. A river of invisible pressure ran alongside every river of water, and nations built canals not only for boats, but for power. In that roar, people heard destiny. The engine's steady beat replaced the heartbeat of family rooms. Inventors spoke of taming the elements, and newspapers printed sermons to industry in the same language once reserved for miracles. When railways arrived, the locomotive was a chapel of flame. On wheels, a travelling furnace that made distance small. We had carried embers from house to house. Now we carry them from age to age. Not everyone believed. Some still kept the old rituals. Bread baked in village ovens. Candles lit in windows at dusk. The winter room arranged around a single stove. But the centre of heat had moved from people to systems. What mattered was no longer this fire, tended by these hands, but the vast collective blaze, humming behind walls and under streets. With mastery came price. Woodlands thinned, skies tinted brown, rivers ran warm with waste heat. Coal's gift, consistency, had a shadow, accumulation. Chimney sweeps no longer visited cottages. They clung to flues the heights of towers. Children who once fell asleep to the sound of a log splitting now dreamed to the grind of gears. Coughs replaced lullabies in certain neighbourhoods. The cold that had once threatened our bodies returned as a silence inside our rooms, because the more perfect heat became, the less it asked of us. Radiators did not need stories. Switches did not require patience. The exquisite intimacy between a person and their fire, the negotiation, the attention, loosened. We were warmer, yes. We were safer, yes. But the conversation was closed. Still, the old intelligence of warmth refused to vanish. Designers began to hide ancient tricks in modern buildings. Thick walls that absorb heat by day and yield it by night. Atriums that pull air like medieval smoke holes in reverse. South-facing glass for winter sun. Deep eaves for summer shade. In the north, the ghost of the longhouse returned as low, tight envelopes and communal spaces. In the mountains, the logic of stables under living rooms reappeared as thermal zoning. In cities, tiled stoves endured in corners, like quiet elders who knew more than they said. Engineers spoke new words. Convection, conductivity, radiant. For the same realities a peasant once felt by palm and cheek. The physics in our textbooks are the sagas of those rooms rewritten in numbers. Every modern comfort is a translation of an old survival trick, but a translation can lose poetry. That's why even after furnaces and boilers and grids, people still build fireplaces. They rarely need them. They want them, not for heat, for meaning. A home without a flame can be perfect and empty. A candle can make it human again. Industry did something else fire at home never could. It externalized consequence. If your hearth smoked, you coughed. If your plant smoked, a village downwind coughed. The hearth taught personal responsibility. The stack taught abstraction. It became easy to love warmth and ignore cost. Then came oil and gas. Flames summoned with a click, shipped from deserts and seabeds. Clean, fast, invisible. The line from ember to engine became a wire, a pipe, a contract. Nations negotiated heat the way families once argued over seat distance from the fire. Armies marched for it. Policies were written in its name. Winters were gambled on it. We had turned warmth from a household miracle into geopolitics. Yet the human measure endured. A storm knocks out power, and the timeline collapses. Neighbours share stovetops. Wood piles open. Someone with a generator becomes the village oven. The social technology, older than any grid, reappears overnight. Come in, sit close, we'll manage. It's tempting to call that regression. It isn't, it's a recall. The code of warmth is hardwired. A culture that forgets it risks confusing supply with care, heat with hospitality. There are new fires now, clean, quiet, almost alchemical. Heat pumps that pull warmth from freezing air. Solar thermal that bottles summer for January. Geothermal loops that borrow the Earth's steady pulse like a turf house scaled down and perfected. Engineers draw diagrams that Vikings might recognise by feel. The future bends, again, toward that first wisdom. Don't fight nature. Work with it. Progress always returns to the longhouse in some disguise, because the longhouse isn't a building, it's a principle. Share heat. Trap it. Let materials carry it for you. Accept small discomforts to gain large resilience. Keep the centre alive. Factories taught us scale. Homes taught us sufficiency. Between them lives the lesson we keep relearning. Warmth is an ecosystem of choices. Fuel, design, habit, care. If anyone fails, the whole shiver. If they align, even brutal climates become livable without arrogance. And so the fire that built the future leaves us with two truths that sound like opposites and are not. First, there is no going back to smoky rooms and burning eyes. The dignity of clean, reliable heat is a human right won at terrible cost. Second, there is no forward without memory. The dignity of connection, of seeing warmth as shared, tended, meaningful, is not guaranteed by any machine. The next stage of heat won't be measured only in degrees, but in how gently it keeps us human. Imagine a winter evening 100 years from now. The city hums softly on renewable power. Homes are sealed, efficient, warm. In one window, a family gathers by a narrow, sealed firebox that emits no smoke, a mere ribbon of flame behind glass. They don't need it, they light it anyway. Someone tells a story, someone listens. Breath fogs the glass for a second, then clears. That is not nostalgia, that is continuity. The ember that once glowed beneath ash in a Viking hall has survived every transformation we've put it through, not as carbon, but as culture. It asks the same thing it always has. Will you notice me? Will you share it with me? Will you keep me for the night and give me away in the morning? We built engines that could cross oceans. We built grids that ignore storms and drought. We built systems grand enough to heat a planet. And we may have. The work ahead is to remember scale without forgetting touch, to design for comfort without designing out care. Because the future we deserve is not only warm, it is warm-minded, warm-hearted. A future where children still learn how to feel a room with their skin, where architects still draw with winter in mind, where neighbours still see someone's light at midnight and know they are not alone. Every age thinks it invented warmth. The truth is softer. Warmth keeps inventing us. The ember is still in our hands. Not the fuel, the choice. How we make it, how we share it, how we honour what it costs. The medieval person would recognise that responsibility instantly. They'd look at our powers, smile, and ask the only question that matters in any century. Is your fire only yours, or does it belong to the room? The answer will decide more than comfort. It will decide the shape of our winters, the tone of our cities, the feel of our evenings, the kind of people we become when the glass goes dark and the wind rises. And somewhere, as you read this, someone is banking a real fire. Slow, careful, quiet, the way it has always been done. Not to worship the past, but to respect the night. The future begins there, as it always has, with one small, patient light and hands that know what to do. The world no longer ends in darkness, it ends in light. Too much of it sometimes. From towers, from screens, from streets that never sleep. We have made a world where night never really comes, and in doing so, we've forgotten what it feels like to sit in true darkness and watch a single flame breathe. Every age ends the same way, with someone watching a small light in the dark. There is no more fitting image of humanity than that. A figure, silent, face half lit, waiting. We have stood like that for 100,000 winters, from the caves of the Ice Age to the longhouses of the north, from monasteries to apartment windows glowing above frozen streets. Always the light has meant the same thing. We're still here. It doesn't matter if it's a candle or a campfire or a phone held beneath a blanket. It's all the same defiance, the same desire to make the void smaller. When you think of the Middle Ages, think not of swords or kings, but of that simple, steady act. Someone tending the coal so others might wake warm. That gesture has no era. It is a miniature human story. Every civilization ends, but the hand that guards the fire never does. Even now, in this world of perfect climate control, we find ways to recreate that moment. We light candles on birthdays, torches in remembrance, lamps in windows for those who haven't come home. We build bonfires on beaches to mark the turning of seasons we barely feel anymore. Somewhere deep inside, we remember that warmth was once an act of love. That's why the image of fire still moves us. The fireplace in a film. The flicker of lanterns at a vigil. The first light after a power cut. It's not comfort we're seeing, it's memory. We look into it and see everyone who ever sat by one before. The Vikings who melted snow from their beards, the peasants who prayed for dawn, the monks who guarded flame through centuries of war and plague, the mothers who woke at midnight to feed it back to life. They are all there in every spark. The fire remembers its keepers. It remembers the voices that once spoke beside it, the songs it carried, the words it heard when the wind howled outside. And in that memory is something larger than history, a connection that time can't erase. Because warmth was never just heat. It was meant to be visible. It told us we belonged to each other. It told us the world could still be gentle. Maybe that's what we're still searching for. Not warmth of air, but warmth of presence. The light that doesn't just illuminate, but forgives. And maybe at the end of everything, when the last cities have gone quiet, when all our inventions fade, someone will still sit in the dark and watch a flame. Not because they need it, but because they remember why it mattered. In the beginning there was fire. In the end, there will be someone keeping it. So tonight, wherever you are, in the silence of a warm room or the breath of a cold one, pause. Look at the light nearest to you. A lamp, a candle, a screen. It doesn't matter. Remember that every bit of warmth you feel was given to you by 1,000 forgotten hands. And if you feel grateful, even for a second, then the fire did its job. It lived through them. It lives through you. And as long as you remember, it will never go out. Fire was our first teacher, and maybe it will be our last. Before language, before music, before gods, there was light on a wall and a circle of faces staring into it. The first stories were not spoken. They were traced in shadow by firelight. The earliest art flickered before it dried. The first rhythm was the heartbeat that matched the flame's slow pulse. Every idea humanity ever had began with something burning. The flame taught us attention. It asked us to watch without touching, to learn by seeing, to wait. It turned motion into meaning. The same motion that would one day become writing, painting, architecture, song. When the flame danced, the mind followed. We learned memory from fire. The ember that survived the night was proof that yesterday had happened. Every morning, relighting the hearth was a resurrection. Generations measured time not by stars, but by how long the coals lasted. Fire gave us the past. Warmth gave us a reason to remember it. The Greeks told of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. But long before myth named it, people understood the theft. Every spark was defiance. Fire belonged to the heavens, yet we dared to keep it. From that act came every invention since. To light the dark was to change the order of things. The medieval world never lost that reverence. Even as they tamed it into chimneys and stoves, they still sensed the mystery. They built their faiths around light, their fears around heat, their hopes around endurance. They understood that the flame was not theirs to own, only to borrow. Every human generation inherits fire on loan. We pass it from hand to hand, in candles at vigils, in torches at weddings, in lamps beside the dying. It's the same motion every time. A small lean forward, a moment of breath, a sharing of light. Civilization condensed into one gesture. The monks who copied books by candlelight didn't just preserve words, they preserved the colour of flame across centuries of ink. The Vikings who built longhouses around central hearths didn't just keep out the cold, they kept alive the habit of gathering, of belonging. The peasants who guarded their coals through endless winters carried not heat, but heritage. To keep the fire was to keep the story of being human. Even now when we speak of spark and glow and burn, we're quoting that first conversation. Every metaphor of inspiration, every phrase of love or anger, still smoulders with its origin. We talk about light bulb moments, but what we mean is the return of fire, the rediscovery of vision. Look at a modern city from above at night. It's a sea of stars turned upside down, constellations on Earth. Each point of light is a continuation of that first flame, multiplied 1,000,000 times. The planet itself has become a single hearth, yet the pattern is the same. light against dark, the fragile persistence of warmth in an indifferent void. The universe is mostly cold. Fire is how life remembers itself. Every forge, every hearth, every candle is a small rebellion against entropy. It says not yet, and maybe that's why we can't stop lighting things. Bonfires, lanterns, fireworks, screens. We are a species of ignition. We cannot resist the desire to see the world illuminated one more time. But the flame has a memory of its own. It carries every breath that ever fed it, every story told beside it, every face it ever illuminated. When we light a fire, we call those memories back. The heat on your skin is the same physics that warmed a Viking child, the same colour that lit a monk's page, the same radiance that glowed in a peasant's hut. All flames are one flame, divided by time. And when this age ends, when our towers cool and our circuits fall silent, someone will still find a way to make light. Maybe with wood, maybe with sun, maybe with something we can't yet name. They'll sit beside it, listen to its voice, and feel that old, impossible calm. Because the fire doesn't belong to history. History belongs to the fire. It shaped us, tested us, revealed us. It taught us to gather, to imagine, to endure. It told us that life was not given, it was tended. It told us that everything burns, but meaning can survive the ashes. When the last fire dies, the stories will remember its light. And so the flame continues, in glass and metal, in word and memory, in you. Every time you choose to be kind instead of cruel, to build instead of break, to share instead of hoard, you are doing what every ancestor did before you. You are keeping the fire. Let it burn quietly, let it warm, not scorch. Let it travel farther than you. And when you finally step away, may someone else see its glow and understand what it means. That the night is long, but never absolute. That warmth is fragile, but never alone. That we are temporary, but the flame is not. The last ember glows, small and perfect. Around it, the air cools. The night begins its slow return. Somewhere a door creaks, a breath sighs, and for a moment, nothing moves. This is how every story ends, not with applause, not with final words, but with the hush that follows, a fire being gently covered with ash. The warmth lingers, the light softens, and the world exhales. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it, that soft crackle of everything we've ever been, the sound of work and hope and love surviving the dark. Every age has its fires, every life its winters, and every time we find a way to keep the flame. And if this story stayed with you tonight, if you could almost feel the warmth of those longhouses, the silence of the monasteries, the small light that still burns somewhere in the dark, then don't let that flame fade. Like the people who came before us, every time you share a story, you're tending a fire. Every time you listen, you're keeping it alive. And every time you remember, you're part of the same lineage of warmth that began 1,000 years ago. If you felt that connection tonight, give this video a like. It helps this fire reach others who might need it. Subscribe to Viking Times for more journeys into the forgotten corners of human endurance, where survival, faith and invention all meet in the glow of history. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your village, your country. Because every comment becomes another ember in this global hearth we've built together. No matter how far apart we are, we still gather around the same flame. The same hunger for light, for warmth, and for the stories that keep us human.